Although there's not a lot of indicators in the past that can tell us about the connection between ancient Egypt and India, there are still a lot that explicitly mention India, especially in the later days, in the days of Cleopatra. The interesting thing about this is that they're trustworthy because they're in Egypt and they have a point of view to compare worlds before and worlds after. In the earlier years, of course, someone like Xerxes, according to Herodotus, opened up the gate. For the first time in probably forever, India and Egypt have never been as connected as they were during the time of Xerxes. Now, this might not be completely true in all ways, but it is true, at least for Egypt, that they did not get things directly. But there is an indicator from Strabo who mentions that the Indians, to some degree, traveled through the waters and made their journey to Ethiopia, and then those goods made their way to Egypt. In order to start the investigation, what we have to do is look at the ancient Egyptians' opinions themselves. Now, here is a document, a stele of the king called Nebtawire or Nebtawira, if you can see the names of the gods initiated in that name. And it's interesting because here Hammamet itself is seen as part of the foreign lands, and it is seen as an extension to places which are foreign, like Ethiopia, like Arabia, and like those other places in the north, like Syria. If we look at the lines, second last, we can see here the indicator of this. For example, second to last, it says, "Now it was the majesty of this august God, Lord of the foreign lands, who made the sacrifice to son Nabtawira. May he live forever." The whole thing, it's a very short stele, talks about him expeditioning to this area rather than just going there. This is part of the limits of ancient Egypt. This is not a typical journey for a king. So the chances that this place had access to India at this time are close to zero. Even during the times of Ramses IV, what we see is something completely different than what we'd see in later years. And this will be explained during Strabo's time. Strabo does mention that the important thing that happens later is an increase of Indian merchants, but he does give some indicators that in prior years there were still some very small amount of ships that made their way to that area. If we look here at this Hammamet stela, what we can see is that if we read here, "Lo, His Majesty gave command to the scribe of the house of sacred writings, Ramesses Eshahab, the scribe of crown possessions, the prophet of the house of Min, Hersiesi in Coptus, Usermare knocked to seek thee for the place of truth." All of these are still indicators. All of these are still indicators that they're quite far away from India. Now, the reason might seem like something as simple as, oh, they're just too far away from one another. But that is not the only reason. You see, the Arabian areas have always been populated with people, and they're pretty much war zones for the most part. And these war zones did not or were not opportunity spots for people who wanted to trade long term, which is why even in the times of the Swahili coast, when the Swahili coast from the 1st century AD till later, I mean, even today, what we see is that they don't use the Arabian areas as a point of trade. The Arabs use the Arabian areas, but Indians and Ethiopians, they don't dare go through those areas. Instead, they wait for the monsoon, which means they have to wait for the opportune moment, round about August. The Mashwesh are a group of Libyans that were connected to places like Nubia, and they had access to places like Asia, traveling wise. These Mashwesh people are indicated in a stele inside of Hammamat, and this isn't just a stele that just puts them there for no reason. It is because there was an attempt at conquering that is long through, and with the Nubian help, could have been one of the biggest losses in history. If there are words in ancient Egyptian that mention India as a location, I am not aware of them. Now, there are words that I've shown you that means the furthest limits to the east, which started off as the furthest limits to the west, but means the furthest limits to the east. And this might be an indicator of the country of India or even the furthest parts of Arabia, maybe even Pakistan. Now, we know that this word was used later times to refer to India because when Xerxes came and places like that, the furthest limits of the east were expanded. I think during Xerxes' time, they were aware of China, they just didn't take it over at the time. And the Egyptians, probably the ones who are located in Egypt, would have had no idea about China. Now, it's important that I put this picture up because what we are looking here at is an African man dressed in Indian Chinese silks. Although silk was discovered a long time ago in China, even around 4000 BC, the invention, the technology, did not make its way towards Africa, especially through the Egyptian areas, until around 1200 BC or even 1100 BC. Before that, linen was the common cloth. There are some people who say that the linen as well could have been an indicator between India and Egypt, but that doesn't help too because there is an obvious invention inside of Egypt. Now, of course, we know with the new Sumerian DNA that people who at least had DNA close to people in India had access to Egypt. This opens up the opportunity for there to be a connection and even for stuff like silks to make their way there. But still, to those early days, 4000 BC till about 1000 BC, it was confined strictly to China and India. And of course, we would have expected that the Egyptians would have loved silk. And we know that because when it finally made its way to Egypt, it became much appreciated by the local population. But let's not talk about theoreticals. We can go straight to Strabo, who, even in his day, he saw an increase of Indian merchants moving into Hammamat and these general trading areas that are located with Arabia. Now, as much as most of the boats in ancient Egypt were developed in order to cross rivers rather than the sea, there were some seaworthy ships, and these ships went the furthest. And we can read here from an ancient Egyptian writing, Zakar Damon's Wenamun's papers. So you can see here, he said to me, Behold, if thou art true, where is the writing of a moon which is in thy hand? Where is the letter of the high priest of Amun, which is in thy hand? I said to him, I gave them to Nesabednebded and Tentamon. Then he was very wroth, and he said to me, Now behold the writings, and the letter are not in thy hand. Where is the ship of cedar, which that name gave to thee? Where is Syrian crew? He would not deliver thy business to the ship captain to have thee killed, that they might cast thee into the sea. From whom would they have sought the God then? So spake he to me. I said to him, there are indeed Egyptian ships and Egyptian crews who sail under Nebuchadnezzar, but he hath no Syrian crews. He said to me, there are surely 20 ships here in my harbor. That, by the way, is just to prove it. I mean, it's obvious because Egypt had taken over some of these parts in the longest years, and they lost some of their territories in the later years. And so we don't really think of places as far as Syria as part of Egypt, but at one time they really were. And so Arabia was just a hop away, given exactly where Egypt started as a nation. To fully understand where exactly these opinions are coming from, we have to look at Syene. Syene, and you look at it, has multiple people living in the area. Of course, it has Nubians since it's a historically Nubian area. But now, by this date, it has Romans and it has Egyptians. And as you can see here written, these people are all attested for in the region. Egypt is now a province, and it not only pays considerable tribute, but also is governed by prudent men. The prefects who are sent there from time to time, now he who is sent has the rank of the king, and subordinates to him is the administrator of justice, who has supreme authority over most of the lawsuits. And another is the official called ideologus, who inquires into all properties that are without owners and that ought to fall to Caesar. And these are attended by freedmen of Caesar, as also by stewards who are entrusted with affairs of more or less importance. There are also 3 legions of soldiers, one of which is stationed in the city and the others in the country. And apart from these, there is 9 Roman cohorts in Syene as a guard for the region, and 3 in the rest of the country. And there are also 3 bodies of cavalry, which likewise as are assigned to the various critical points of the native officials in the city. One is the interpreter, who is clad in purple, has hereditary prerogatives, and has charge of the interest of the city, and another the recorder, and another the chief judge, and the fourth the knight commander. Now these officers existed also in the time of the kings, but since the kings were carrying on a bad government, the prosperity of the city was also vanishing on account of the prevailing lawlessness. At any rate, Polybius, who had visited the city, is disgusted with the state of affairs under the regional kings. What makes matters worse for him is that the journey to Egypt is an extremely long one, and he mentions this. To go to Egypt, a long and painful journey, such then, if not worse, was the state of affairs under the later kings also. But the Romans have to the best of their ability, I might say, set most things right, having organized the city as I have said, and having appointed throughout the country officials called epistrategy, and nomarchs and ethnarchs, who were thought worthy to superintend affairs of the great importance. Among the happy advantages of the city, the greatest is the fact that this is the only place in all of Egypt which is by nature well suited with reference to both things, both to commerce by the sea. This is the important part. So, in this area, it is controlled by three types of people: Nubians, ancient Egyptians. So, they separate those two: Nubians, ancient Egyptians, mixed people, mixed with both Romans and Greeks. I skipped that part. We don't need to read it, but I showed you that there's mixed Romans and mixed Greeks, and then actual Romans and actual Greeks who are not mixed at all, on account of the good harbors and to commerce by land, because the river easily conveys and brings together everything into a place so situated, the greatest emporium in the inhabited world. According to these words, we can see that already we are getting a highlight and commentary on this one area. Of course, from the sea, you can't just travel just however you want. So there are rivers that connect it to Syene and places like that. So he continues. Now, one might call these the excellent attributes of a city. And as for the revenues of Egypt, Cicero tells about them in a certain speech, saying that a tribute of 12,500 talents was paid annually to Orlitz, the father of Cleopatra. If then the man who administered the kingdom in the worst and most careless way obtained so large a revenue, what should one think of the present revenues, which are managed with the Indians and the troglodytes? Now, if you don't know, the troglodytes are an Ethiopian Libyan group, but the Indians obviously would be people from India, has been increased to so great an extent in earlier times, at least not so many as 20 vessels would dare to traverse the Arabian Gulf far enough to get a peep outside the straits. So you can see here, this is the important part. And according to Strabo, he tells us three things. One is that India now has become a huge market. So let's read it again. What should one think of the present revenues, which are managed with so much diligence, and when the commerce with the Indians and the troglodytes has been increased to so great an extent in earlier times, at least not so many as 20 vessels would dare to traverse the Arabian Gulf far enough to get a peep outside the straits? So this isn't even talking about the Indians. Like, even the people of the Arabian Gulf would not enter Egypt in such a large way that you would get the types of profits that these Romans are getting at this time. Again, this is an indicator that the Indians, if they did go to these areas, it was probably mostly for curiosity. Now, of course, during Xerxes' time, it was a little different because he opened up that route, and any danger that could have existed was stopped because he controlled that whole area, the whole India to Egypt area. And we don't need to read it, but in Herodotus's book, they talk about how some Egyptians were stationed in India and how some Indians were stationed in Egypt. But at present time, even large fleets are dispatched as far as India and the extremities of Ethiopia. So, packed within these few pages is very powerful meanings. Firstly, the connection between the Ethiopians and the Egyptians. Now, when they say extremities here, they don't mean, when he says Nubia, they write Nubia and they point to Nubia. They don't mean Nubia. When they say extremities of Ethiopia, they're talking about places where you have to go by ship to get there. This might even be indicating as low as Somalia. Now, I want to be careful because these are one of those pages that were used in the past by white supremacists to try and say that the stuff found in Great Zimbabwe was things left over by Cleopatra or any of those ancient Egyptians. There is no real connection between those two, except that Great Zimbabwe did trade long distance through the Swahili coast, and Egypt was one of their trade partners. Now, I don't believe that it is a coincidence that they mention India and Ethiopia in the same sentence, especially when you talk about the sea, because, of course, what ocean do you travel from India all the way to Egypt? The Arabs called the Indian Ocean the Ethiopian Ocean. The Egyptians called it the Ethiopian Ocean. The Indians called it the Ethiopian Ocean. And then everybody else, like the people who are Zanj and others, called it the Indian Ocean, which is pretty interesting. In part two, we will discuss the exact things that were transported to this region and why they put such high taxes on these people. Now, remember, the Romans and the Greeks, when they brought things to this area, they were not friendly necessarily to the ancient Egyptians. And even though there's stories about how they were liberate, they looked at the others as liberators and all of that. Empire is empire. No one loves living under other people. And even though the ancient Egyptians at this time, I mean, we know that the final king of Egypt, final native king of Egypt, had long gone. Those days are long over. But the people living in Egypt themselves were still tied to the ancient world, even around 100 AD, and as we get further. But the more we go in years, the more the language just dies. The more everything starts to die. And this is probably why a lot of these records that we can read today, easily translated today, that give us indicators of India, if we had people who lived in that time, they could have told us. Like, that word doesn't mean the furthest part to the east, it means India. Just like how today, when if someone was to dig up the word South Africa, it's possible that someone would not be able to understand that it was not a direction but a area. And just like this thing that says the furthest part of the east might be a word for India rather than a word just meaning the furthest part of the east. The types of things that were traded at this time were so numerous that for any greedy person, they would be jealous of the success that these people were doing at the time. I mean, remember, paper started being used more and more, or papyrus started being used more and more at this time as well. Now, that's the information based on what we have read. But if I have to give my opinion rather than just going purely on facts, I do not believe that the Mauryan Empire did not have access to Egypt. I 100% believe that at one time they had access to Egypt. And I think that the Romans and the Greeks did open up that route and make it more. But I believe it had existed for a couple hundred years. And of course, everything here is from the perspective of the Egyptians. But what about the other side? What did the people learn on the other side in India about the ancient Egyptians or even the Romans and the Greeks at the time? Now, we know the Romans and the Greeks had access. That is not a question. But what about the pre Roman period, the pre, you know, Ptolemaic period, and maybe even the pre Xerxes period? In the second part, we will explore what big role the ancient Ethiopians played as well, because ivory is the one object that has real indicators that Ethiopian ivory from Ethiopia, the country that is called Ethiopia today, might have made its way as far as India back in the day. Now, this does not mean that India and Ethiopia would have been connected directly, but at least through trade networks, they might have been connected. And I'm not talking about in AD. We know from AD, we've got indicators that from the first century AD all the way till today, India and Ethiopia have been doing large scale trading. And this large scale trading is due to the fact that they had a limited time to trade. They couldn't just trade every single day. So they had a large amount of trade that came. We're even going to discuss that period as well, because a lot of the fabrics we find in the Ethiopian areas, whenever you find them, they're made of Indian cloth. But we know the Ethiopians had their own cloth as well. So the question is, why are they buying cloth from India? And generally, people say it's because it was of superior make, but it also has to do with silks. It also has to do with other fabrics that you just did not find in large numbers inside of Africa at that time. Africa had cotton. That was the majority of textile that they had. Silk existed too, as we can see with places like the Congo, which had limited access to Indian trade networks, but they used local silkworms to create that silk. Which, by the way, having silk traded to your region does not teach you how to make silk. That's why the Silk Road existed, because the Romans and the Greeks who had silk come to their areas, they were like, how the hell is this made? And they wanted to know the origin of it. They wanted to know, how do we get there? The story on how they got there and Justinian and all these people is a long story. Again, one of the best videos that I've seen on YouTube about it is from Words of the Past, a documentary channel, where they talk about China and Rome. Okay, thank you for watching. This has been the Tales of Ancient Egypt and India.